So hello sa lahat. Ngayon yung fourth meeting ng series natin na Postmodernism and its Children. And ngayon yung topic natin is Critical Race Theory and Intersectionality. So as a disclaimer, ang series natin ay heavily nag-rely sa book nila Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay entitled Cynical Series, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. So yung main na information ng pag-explain ko, kinuha ko sa kanila. So what we will do first, I'll give an introduction about critical race theory, paano ito kumalat, and i-discuss din natin yung critical race theory as applied postmodernism. So paano ma-justify kung baga yung categorization sa kanya na yun. And second, we will talk about intersectionality and yung intersectionality rin in connection with applied postmodernism. And third, we'll give yung critique natin based from a Christian worldview. So mag-start muna tayo sa introduction about critical race theory. So ang critical race theory, formally siya na nag-arose noong 1917 mula sa critical na pag-study ng law. So yung ibig sabihin ng critical is that ang intention and methods ay specifically geared para ma-identify and expose yung mga problems para maka-facilitate ng revolutionary na political change. So nakita nila ito na significant dahil maraming activists felt that may need pa rin to continue to work against racism. And dahil sa series of profound na legal changes, ay ang racism ay less clearly demonstrable na. Dahil dito, they adopted critical approaches. Ang critical na approach na ito, tulad ng ibang methods ng cultural criticism, ay divided into materialist and postmodern approaches. Based sa kanilang name, ang materialist race critics ay nag-serialize tungkol sa material systems, such as economic, legal, and political, na nakaka-affect sa mga racial minorities. Ang postmodern theorists naman, by contrast, ay mas concerned sa linguistic and social systems. And dahil dito ay ang aim nila is to deconstruct yung mga discourses, mag-detect ng implicit biases, at mag-counter ng underlying na racial assumptions and attitudes. Dahil sa fundamental na difference sa focus na ito, may mga materialists na nag-criticize ng postmodernists dahil ang discourses nila ay intangible and subjective na nag-take place sa mga milieus na wealthy and academic. And also, that they neglect salient material issues tulad ng poverty. Ang counter dito ng mga postmodernists is that while ang material reality ay of practical importance, hindi ito meaningfully ma-improve kung yung current discourses ay nag-continue na i-prioritize yung white people. So ang parehong materialist and postmodern notions ng critical race theory ay nag-react against liberalism at ito ay nag-embrace ng form ng radicalism. So yung sabi ng critical race theorists na sila Richard Delgado and John Stefancic sa Critical Race Theory and Introduction, quote, unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law, end quote. Ang sabi rin nila, quote, critical race scholars are disconnected with liberalism as a framework for addressing America's racial problems. Many liberals believe in colorblindness and neutral principles of constitutional law. They believe in equality, especially equal treatment for all persons, regardless of their histories or current situations. End quote. Dahil dito, we can say na ang pag-reject ng critical race theory sa liberalism ay among the strongest sa nature nito. At ito ang most enduring. The late Derek Bell, ang first na tenured African-American professor sa Harvard Law School, ay often regarded as the progenitor ng critical race theory, which is a name na derived from critical legal theory, tapos linagay lang ang race sa kanyang area of specialty. Si Bell ay isang materialist and kilala siya for bringing critical methods para maintindihan ng civil rights and the mga discourses na nag-surround dito. Si Bell ay open advocate ng historical revisionism at best known siya sa interest convergence thesis na makikita sa 1970 na book niya na Race, Racism, and American Law. Ang thesis na ito holds na ang whites ay inalaw lamang ang mga blacks na magkaroon ng rights dahil sa kanilang self-interest. Isa itong depressing na view na nag-deny ng possibility of any moral progress na nakamit since the Jim Crow era. Makikita rin na in-state ni Bell sa 1987 book niya na "And We Are Not Saved, The Elusive Quest for Racial Justice," quote, "Progress in American race relations is largely a mirage, obscuring the fact that whites continue, consciously or unconsciously, to do all in their power to ensure their dominion and maintain their control." End quote. Ang cynical na pessimism na ito ay nag-pervade sa analysis ni Bell. For instance, kinonsider din niya na ang white people ay nag-introduce ng desegregation, hindi bilang solution sa problema ng black people, pero para ma-further nila ang interests nila habang sinusuppress ang black radicalism during the Cold War. Dahil dito sa pervasive na belief niya sa irreparable na system of white dominance sa US society, ang argument niya is that ang changes made rito would lead to a whole new set of problems kung saan ay ang white superiority would continually assert itself over the interests ng black people. Ito ay typical sa critical race mood during that time. Ang contemporary niya na si Alan Freeman ay similarly cynical at pessimistic, and nagsulat din siya ng mga legal papers na nag-argue na ang anti-racist na legislation ay actually nag-support ng racism. Ang materialist na critical race theorists ay madalas mag-advocate for black nationalism and segregation over universal human rights and cooperation. Ang supposed na empirical analysis nila of material reality ayon kay Pluckrose and Lindsay shows na ang racism and discrimination ay hindi nag-decrease, and it is said na it looks like more like cherry picking and generalizing from worst examples. Though nag-persist ang pessimism ng mga materialists, ang approach nila did not. Ang mga materialists ay nag-dominate sa critical race movement from the 1970s to the 1980s. Pero from the 1990s, yung mga postmodernists na ay increasingly nag-increase sa power and influence. Over time, ang postmodernists ay nag-focus sa microaggressions, hate speech, safe spaces, cultural appropriation, implicit association tests, media representation, whiteness, and other familiar trappings sa current racial discourse. Ang change na ito owes much sa influence ng mga female na critical race theorists na naging prominence nung late 1980s and 1990s. And sila ay nag-promote ng black feminist thought. Kasama rito sila Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, and Patricia Hill Collins. Ang mga scholars na ito ay happy to blur ang boundaries ng scholarly disciplines habang sila ay nag-argue passionately about both patriarchy and white supremacy in ways na nag-mix ang legal sa sociological, literary, and autobiographical in specifically gendered ways. Significantly, ay nag-complain sila about whiteness ng feminism. Dahil dito ay nag-set sila ng stage for another wave ng mga influential theorists tulad nila Patricia Williams, Angela Harris, and Kimberly Crenshaw. So, si Crenshaw, siya yung student ni Bell na tumulong sa kanya para i-create ang term na critical race theory. Ang mga scholars na ito ay humugod sa critical race theory para masama ang class analysis, feminism, and para ma-incorporate ang gender and sexuality. Ito ay nag-produce ng highly layered na analysis ng identity and experience kung saan ay kasamang social, legal, and economic factors. Sa pag-look sa multiple na systems ng power and privilege, and sa pag-privilege sa experience bilang source of knowledge, ay they moved away from materialist analysis and they moved toward the postmodern. Ang change na ito ay nag-imply ng new commitments. Wala nang central focus sa material realities na relevant sa systemic and structural understandings ng racism, lalo na sa poverty. Ito ay replaced ng analysis of discourse at power. At the same time, ang critical race theory ay nag-invest heavily sa identity politics and sa supposed na intellectual justification nito, which is ang standpoint theory. Ito ang idea na ang identity and position natin sa society ay nag-influence how we come to knowledge. Ang developments na ito, kasama ang pag-blur ng boundaries and dissolution ng individual in favor ng group identity, ay nag-reveal ng dominance ng postmodern thought sa critical race theory noong early 1990s. Ang shift na ito ayon kay Pluckrose and Lindsay ay evident sa writings that time. They cited, for example, ang work ni Patricia Williams. So siya ang professor ng commercial law and best known siya sa book-length na autobiographical essay entitled The Alchemy of Race and rights. Ang publisher nito, ang Harvard University Press, ay dinescribe ito as operating sa intersection ng race, gender, and class. At ang nag-evoke ito ng blurring ng boundaries na common sa postmodern approaches. Ang sabi nila, quote, Williams casts the law as a mythological text in which the powers of commerce and the Constitution, wealth and poverty, sanity and insanity, wage war across complex and overlapping boundaries of discourse. And deliberately transgressing such boundaries, she pursues a path toward racial justice that is ultimately transformative. End quote. Sa critical race theory na nag-emerge, ay makita rin natin ang focus sa language and discourses at sa need na i-disrupt ito. Si Pluckers and Lindsay admits may validity sa applied na postmodern na argument na mahirap i-correct ang mga societal na imbalances if hindi mo na ma-address ang mga prejudice na attitudes at assumptions. Kung saan ay rightly observed daw ito ng mga theorists when they talk about discourses. Ang best na practical use raw ng recognition na ito ay ang rigorous na scholarship sa social attitudes around race. Kaso, sa mga applied postmodernists, ay ang focus nila sa discourses ay concerned primarily sa positionality. So yung positionality, siya yung idea na yung position ng isang person sa society as determined ng kanilang group identity ang mag-dictate ng understanding niya about the world. Ang idea na ito ay central sa critical race theory, as is evident sa very first lines ng book ni Williams na The Alchemy. Quote, subject position is everything in my analysis of the law. End quote. Pagkatapos nito ay nag-articulate siya ng importance ng language at discourses at ang need na i-disrupt ang mga ito sa pamamagitan ng pag-blur ng boundaries between meaning, legal, and otherwise. Sabi niya, quote, I'm interested in the way in which legal language flattens and confines in absolutes the complexity of meaning inherent in any given problem. I'm trying to challenge the usual limits of commercial discourse by using an intentionally double-voiced and relational rather than a traditionally legal black letter vocabulary. End quote. Ang postmodern na concept ng positional na self ay evident. Ito ay isang socially constructed na identity na nag-occupy ng particular location within the privilege oppression landscape. Ang legal scholar na si Angela Harris ay dinevelop ang idea na ito further sa pag-advocate ng multiple consciousness or standpoint theory. Ang sabi niya sa Race and Essentialism and Feminist Legal Theory, quote, it is a premise of this article that we are not born with the self, but rather are composed of a welter of partial, sometimes contradictory, or even antithetical selves, end quote. Ang idea na ito ng multiple na consciousness ay rooted sa identity and positionality. At ito ay nag-recur repeatedly sa postmodern scholarship sa pag-blend ng iba't ibang layers ng marginalized identity. And ito raw ay may malaking impact kung paano ang pagkakaintindi at ang paraan ng pag-aaral ng knowledge sa feminist scholarship at sa critical race theory. Though complex ang pag-consider ng impact ng social position ng isang tao as a speaker and as a knower at sa pag-relate nito sa social positions ng ibang tao around you, ay clear ang pag-explain ng critical race theory sa complex nito, sa concepts nito. Ang ambiguous na postmodern language na makikita sa postcolonial theory and queer theory ay absent sa critical race theory. Probably ay dahil ito ay nanggaling sa legal studies. Ang critical race theory ay nag-maintain ng commitment nito sa role ng discourse sa pag-construct ng social reality and sa pag-address ng mga complex issues. At ito ay hindi nahirapan sa pag-convey nito ng meaning through language. Ang critical race theory ay may political na purpose. At ito ay hindi limited sa pag-deconstruct at pag-disrupt ng meta-narratives. Dahil dito ay mas madali ma-identify ang tenets ng critical race theory. In fact, yung mga scholars nila ay linist ito. Quote, one example ay sa book na Critical Race Theory nila Richard Delgado at John Stefanke. Ang sabi nila, quote, racism is ordinary, not aberrational. So ibig sabihin, ito yung everyday experience ng people of color in the United States. Sabi rin, a system of white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both psychic and material, for the dominant group. So yung white supremacy daw ay systemic at nagbe-benefit lang ng white people. So therefore, yung mga colorblind policies can tackle only the most egregious and demonstrable forms ng discrimination. Sabi rin, the social construction thesis holds that race and races are products of social thought and relations. So yung intersectionality and anti-essentialism, opposition siya sa idea na yung racial difference ay innate, ay need para ma-address daw yung issue na yun, yung pagiging innate ng racial difference. Tapos yung unique voice of color ay nag-exist and minority status brings with it a presumed competence to speak about race and racism. So this is not understood as essentialism but as the product of common experiences ng oppression. So ito yung tinatawag na standpoint theory. So ang core tenets ng mga ito ay ina-assert na malinaw kung ano yung meron sa critical race theory. So ito yung racism being present everywhere and lagi ito nag-work against people of color and ito ay nag-work for the benefit ng white people and hindi aware yung mga white people daw dito dahil sa kanilang privilege. Ang ibang mga theories, ito ay sinama ang fundamental na distrust sa liberalism. So they reject yung meritocracy and may commitment sila to work towards social justice. Next, yung spread ng critical race theory. So now, tapos na tayo sa introduction, mag-move na tayo sa pag-spread ng critical race theory. So dito naman, sila Pluckers and Lindsay ay nag-talk about sa pag-branch off ng critical race theory out of legal studies. At ito ay napunta sa iba't ibang mga disciplines na concerned sa social justice. Ang theory of education daw ay strongly affected. Ang observation nila Delgado and Stefan Kick sa critical race theory and introduction, quote, although CRT began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many scholars in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists who use CRT's ideas to understand issues of school discipline and hierarchy, tracking, affirmative action, high-stakes testing, controversies over curriculum and history, bilingual and multicultural education, and alternative in charter schools. End quote. Sila raw ay nag-list ng strongest footholds ng critical race theory and how it effectively attaches itself sa ibang disciplines. Quote, political scientists ponder voting strategies coined by critical race theorists, while women's studies professors teach about intersectionality, the predicament of women of color and others who sit at the intersection of two or more categories. Ethnic studies courses often include a unit on critical race theory, and the American Studies departments teach material on critical white studies developed by CRT writers. Sociologists, theologians, and healthcare specialists use critical race theory and its ideas. Philosophers incorporate critical race ideas in analyzing issues such as viewpoint discrimination and whether Western philosophy is inherently white in its orientation, values, and method of reasoning. End quote. Indeed, ang critical race theory and feminist na approaches ay nag-assert ng reason ay isang Western na philosophical tradition na unfairly nag-disadvantage ng women at ng racial minorities. Consequently, ay ang critical race theory ay nag-take ng activist na stance. Quote, unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. It tries not only to understand our social situation, but to change it, setting out not only to ascertain how society organizes itself along racial lines and hierarchies, but to transform it for the better. End quote. Dahil dito, ay lagi raw narinig ang language ng critical race theory from activists in all walks of life. Ang sinasabi raw nila ay ang racism ay embedded sa culture and that we cannot escape it. We hear now white people ay inherently racist, ng racism daw ay prejudice plus power para masabi na white people lang yung pwede maging racist. They also say ng people of color lang daw ang pwede mag-talk about racism and ang white people daw ay need na mag-listen and wala raw silang racial stamina to engage in it. They say na racist daw to say na we should not see people in terms of their race or in being colorblind. Ito raw ay attempt to ignore ang pervasive na racism sa society and ito ay nag-perpetuate ng white privilege. Ito raw ay narinig in all walks of life, pero sa US ay pinaka-prevalent daw siya sa college campuses. Sila Delgado and Stefancic sees this as something positive. Ang sabi nila, quote, "As this book went to press, students on several dozen campuses were demonstrating for safe spaces and protection from racially hostile climates, with daily insults, epithets, slurs, and displays of Confederate symbols and flags. These campus climate issues are prompting serious reconsideration among university administrators, and for good reason. With affirmative action under sharp attack, universities need to assure that their campuses are as welcoming as possible. At the same time, a new generation of millennials seems to be demonstrating a renewed willingness to confront illegitimate authority." End quote. Ito raw ay hindi lang part mostly ng campus culture, pero most evident daw siya sa most elite na institutions. Ang intersectionality ay central daw sa culture nito, and it has taken a life of its own outside ng campus. Next, ang critical race theory as applied postmodernism. Dito naman, si Pluckrose and Lindsay addresses ang objection na truly postmodern ang critical race theory. Kahit kasi increasingly postmodern ang focus nito sa discourses, attitudes, and biases, ay may scholars who doubt yung postmodern status ng critical race theory. Ang reason nila dito kasi, yung postmodernism ay typically nag-reject ng shared na meaning and stable na identity. And dahil dito ay ang identity politics ay hindi nag-make sense from an orthodox na postmodern perspective. And yung sabi nila Pluckrose and Lindsay dito, so they concede yung point nila. Sabi nila may point yung mga critics who make this argument, that may right sila to insist na they only recognize the first postmodernists as the true postmodernists. Nevertheless, noong 1980s at early 1990s ay true ng critical race theorists took some core postmodern ideas from the radically deconstructive na first phase at inadapt nila ito sa kanilang new intentionally political na applicable project. Ang mga bagong critical race theorists ay explicitly reject yung mga endless at aimless na deconstruction ng original na postmodernism, and they see it often as a product ng naturally privileged na status ng white male philosophers tulad nila Foucault and Derrida. And they fail daw to account for their privileged positions as white men. Ang black feminist scholar na si Bell Hooks, for example, ay sinulat noong 1980s na ang mga tao who wanted to get rid of subjecthood and coherent voices ay ang mga wealthy na white men. At ang mga voices daw nila ay heard and naging dominant sa society. Sa influential na essay naman ni Angela Harris na Race and Essentialism in Feminist Legal Theory, ay inargue niya na ang feminism failed black women dahil tinrato nila ang experience ng black women as a variation ng experience of white women. Ang mga ideas na ito ay naging develop sa core thought ng critical race theory at naging instrumental ito sa development ng intersectionality. So ngayon, tapos na tayo sa critical race theory as applied postmodernism, and we will now talk about intersectionality. Ang critical race scholar na explicitly na nag-reference ng postmodernism sa kanyang work and also clearly na nag-advocate ng politicized and actionable na version nito ay si Kimberly Crenshaw. Siya ay kinikilala na founder ng critical race theory at ang progenitor ng concept ng intersectionality. Ang intersectionality ay nagsimula bilang isang heuristic, which is a tool na ginagamit to help us discover things ourselves. Pero ito ay long been treated as a theory. At ngayon ay described na siya ni Crenshaw as practice. In-introduce ni Crenshaw ang idea ng intersectionality sa isang polemical na scholarly law paper noong 1989. Yung title nito is Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory and Anti-Racist Politics. Dito, she examines 3 legal discrimination cases, and she uses the metaphor ng isang roadway intersection para i-examine ang ways kung paano ma-experience ng isang individual na may 2 or more marginalized identities ang different forms ng prejudice. She argues na just as someone standing sa intersection of 2 streets ay pwede siya mabangga ng sasakyan from any direction or even by more than one at a time. In the same way ay ang marginalized person could be unable to tell which of their identities is being discriminated against in any given instance. Si Crenshaw ay persuasively nag-argue na hindi sapat ang legislation na nag-prevent ng discrimination on grounds of race and gender para ma-solve yung problem, or the fact ng Black women might experience unique forms of discrimination na hindi na-experience ng white women or Black men. Ang sad na idea na ito was more fully articulated 2 years later sa highly influential na 1991 na essay ni Crenshaw, which is yung Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity, Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. So dito, dinefine niya ang intersectionality bilang isang provisional na concept na nag-link ng contemporary politics with postmodern theory. Para kay Crenshaw, ay ang postmodern na approach sa intersectionality ay nag-allow sa critical race theory and sa feminism na incorporate ang political activism while retaining ang understanding nila ng race and gender as cultural constructs. Also, ang theoretical approach na ito allows for more categories ng marginalized na identity na ma-incorporate sa intersectional analysis. Ito ay nag-add ng panibagong layer and complexity sa concept at sa scholarship and activism na gumagamit nito. Ang theoretical complexity na ito ay tinatawag ni Patricia Hill Collins as the matrix of domination. So sinabi niya ito sa 1990 book niya na Black Feminist Thought. And ito yung nag-encourage daw ayon kay Pluckers and Lindsay ng 2 decades ng activity sa mga scholars and activists. Ang Mapping the Margins naman, nag-provide sila ng means para openly ma-advocate yung identity politics over liberal na universalism. Ang liberal universalism ay nag-seek na mawala yung social significance ng identity categories para matrato ang lahat ng tao equally regardless of their identity. Ang identity politics ay nag-restore ng social significance ng identity categories para ma-valorize ang mga ito as sources of empowerment at community. Ang sabi ni Crenshaw sa Mapping the Margins, quote, "We all recognize the distinction between the claims I am Black and the claim I am a person who happens to be Black. I am Black takes the socially imposed identity and empowers it as an anchor of subjectivity. I am Black becomes not simply a statement of resistance, but also a positive discourse of self-identification, intimately linked to celebratory statements like the Black nationalist, Black is beautiful. I'm a person who happens to be Black, on the other hand, achieves self-identification by straining for a certain universality. In effect, I am first a person, and for a concomitant dismissal of the imposed category, Black, as contingent, circumstantial, non-determinant." End quote. Next, let's move na sa intersectionality and the applied postmodern term. So dito, si Crenshaw sa Mapping the Margins ay nag-critique ng 2 ways on how to see society, which are universal liberalism and ang highly destructive na postmodernism. Ang mainstream na liberal discourse sa discrimination, ayon kay Crenshaw, ay hindi sapat para maintindihan kung paano pinaperpetuate ng structures of power ang discrimination against people na may more than one category of marginalized identity. Dahil ang aim ng liberalism is to remove social expectations sa mga identity categories, such as yung Black people expected to do menial jobs, or women being expected to prioritize domestic and parenting roles. And also na yung rights, freedoms, and opportunities ay dapat available sa lahat ng tao regardless ng kanilang identity. And dahil sa strong focus ng universal liberalism sa individual and sa hindi nila pag-prioritize sa identity categories, yung mga ano na yun, kumbaga specific doctrines na yun, yung reason daw bakit si Crenshaw do not find yung liberalism acceptable. So yung sabi sa Mapping the Margins, quote, "For African Americans, other people of color, and gays and lesbians, among others, identity-based politics has been a source of strength, community, and intellectual development. The embrace of identity politics, however, has been in tension with dominant conceptions of social justice. Race, gender, and other identity categories are most often treated in mainstream liberal discourse as vestiges of bias or domination. That is, as intrinsically negative frameworks in which social power works to exclude or marginalize those who are different. According to this understanding, our liberatory objective should be to empty such categories of any social significance. Yet implicit in certain strands of feminist and racial liberation movements, for example, is the view that social power in delineating difference need not be the power of domination. It can instead be the source of social empowerment and reconstruction. Si Crenshaw ay sa kanila, Pluckers and Lindsay ay nag-initiate ng malaking change dito. Sa height daw ng deconstructive phase ng postmodernism ay nakatulong ito sa pag-enable ng analysis of power structures, and for race and gender ay usefully seen as social constructs. Pero dahil sa radical na skepticism nito ay hindi nito inalaw ang reality ng social structures at categories na kailangan para ma-address ang discrimination. Dahil dito, Crenshaw criticizes yung radical deconstructive na aspect ng postmodernism habang ini-insist niya na cogent naman yung postmodern na political principle. Ang sabi niya, quote, "While the descriptive project of postmodernism of questioning the ways in which meaning is socially constructed is generally sound, this critique sometimes misreads the meaning of social construction and distorts its political relevance. But to say that a category such as race or gender is socially constructed is not to say that category has no significance in our world. On the contrary, a large and continuing project for subordinated people, and indeed, one of the projects for which postmodern series have been very helpful is thinking about the way power has clustered around certain categories and is exercised against others." End quote. Dahil dito, noong early 1990s ay nagpropose si Crenshaw na required ang isang bagong way of thinking. One na nag-accept na nag-exist ang complex layers ng discrimination at ang mga categories ng people at systems of power, kahit ang mga ito ay socially constructed. Ito ay ang intersectionality. Ito ay nag-embrace ng postmodern na political principle, and they accept a variant ng postmodern knowledge principle, which is one na nag-accept ng positional na knowledge. Ang intersectionality ni Crenshaw ay nag-reject ng universality in favor ng group identity. Ito raw ang position nila Crenshaw sa political context niya nung sinulat niya ito, at ganun din sa mga intersectional feminists at sa mga critical race theorists ever since. Ayon sa kanila, Pluckers and Lindsay, sa framework na ito ay ang gender and race ay naging lugar where activism is renewed. At ang influential dito ay yung identity politics. Ang intersectionality daw ang axis kung saan nag-rotate ang applied postmodernism. At ito raw yung seed na mag-germinate as social justice scholarship 20 years later. Dahil dito ay important na intindihin ang intersectionality and ang ways na ginamit nito to preserve ang postmodern principles while making actionable uses sa mga ito. Next. So ngayon tapos na tayo sa critical race theory and intersectionality, and magpo-proceed na tayo sa ating critique. So before I give biblical insights about the issue, we would want to give yung critique na provided rin nila Pluckers and Lindsay sa critical race theory and intersectionality. So dito, mag-give ako ng 4 points na ako yung mismong nag-label. So ito yung 1, critical race theory and intersectionality are pseudoscientific. Number 2, critical race theory and intersectionality destroys itself. Number 3, critical race theory and intersectionality makes people less mentally and emotionally healthy. Number 4, critical race theory and intersectionality are counterproductive against the fight against racism. Next. Mag-start muna tayo sa critical race theory and intersectionality are pseudoscientific. So sa section na complex yet so very simple, si Pluckers and Lindsay mentioned ng meaning and purpose ng intersectionality ay nag-expand. They cited intersectional sociologists such as Patricia Hill Collins and si Sirma Bilge from their book entitled Intersectionality. Quote, "Intersectionality is a way of understanding and analyzing the complexity in the world, in people, and in human experiences. The events and conditions of social and political life and self can seldom be understood as shaped by one factor. They are generally shaped by many factors in diverse and mutually influencing ways. When it comes to social inequality, people's lives and the organization of power in a given society are better understood as being shaped not by a single axis of social division, be it race or gender or class, but by many axes that work together and influence each other. Intersectionality as an analytic tool gives people better access to the complexity of the world and of themselves, end quote. Ang comment nila Pluckers and Lindsay is that ang axis ng social division under intersectionality can be almost infinite. Pero hindi raw ito pwede ma-reduce sa individual. Kahit kasi ang isang person ay unique na individual dahil siya ay unique mix ng marginalized identities, ang person pa rin ay understood through each of those group identities. At ang details ay filled in ng critical theory. Thus, hindi siya understood as an individual. And ang category sa intersectionality ay marami. Aside from race, sex, class, sexuality, gender identity, religion, immigration status, physical ability, mental health, at body size, may subcategories din tulad ng skin tone, body shape, abstruse na gender identities, and sexualities kung saan ay they number in hundreds. And lahat ito ay need maintindihan in relation to one another para ang positionality where they intersect could be identified and engaged. So yes, in one aspect, ay complex siya dahil maraming elements ng identity ang involved. At ang bawat isa ay may different claims sa degree ng marginalization and hindi lahat ay directly comparable. And yet in another sense, we can say na simple siya kasi it does the same thing over and over. They look for power imbalances, bigotry, and biases kasi ina-assume nila ito na present. Rinereduce ng critical race theory and intersectionality ang lahat sa isang variable, which is prejudice. Ang reason sa unequal outcomes ay dahil sa prejudicial bigotry. Ang sabi nila Pluckers and Lindsay is that ang question is just identifying kung paano nagmanifest ang prejudicial bigotry na ito sa isang situation. It assumes na sa bawat situation ay may nagmanifest or nag-exist na prejudice and we need to find a way to show evidence for it. Now, kaya ko nasabi na pseudoscience ang critical race theory and intersectionality ay dahil sa discussion na natutunan ko before about philosophy of science. Ito ay from the philosopher na si Karl Popper. Para kasi sa kanya ay hindi equal lahat ng scientific achievements. Kaya may distinction siya between science and pseudoscience. Ang science for Popper kasi disconfirms and ang pseudoscience confirms. Don't get me wrong, may confirmation din sa science pero Popper qualifies na yung confirmation ay risky na prediction. So let me explain. Ang distinction kasi na ito ay comparison between two thinkers. Ang nasa pseudoscience ay si Sigmund Freud and sa science ay si Albert Einstein. Ang observation ni Popper is that Freud can make any data point to his theory. Like any female behavior could be explained in terms of penis envy, and this make it seem na ang evidence to support Freud's theory seemed to be supported everywhere. In contrast, mas risky ang prediction ni Einstein kasi instead of looking sa past to confirm one's theory, like Freud, si Einstein ay nag-look ahead sa future. This means na if ang future ay hindi nag-match sa prediction ni Einstein, then ang theory ni Einstein would be disproven. And we know na na-proved ang theory ni Einstein sa principle ng falsification dahil he predicted na sa general theory of relativity na ang light bends near a massive na body. Na-prove ito noong 1919 when Arthur Eddington observed sa isang total na solar eclipse na ang light nga ay nagbend as predicted ng general relativity. Thus, ang modern science na we accept today ay testable, refutable, and falsifiable. Obviously, ang critical race theory and intersectionality does not operate sa ganitong terms dahil they assume prejudice everywhere. Hence, it's easy to use anything which will make it seem na everything confirms the theory. Hence, critical race theory and intersectionality ay pseudoscience dahil hindi siya falsifiable. In fact, same siya sa Marxian tradition sa subject ko sa UP na debates in social science. Ang sabi ko sa debate namin sa class is that skeptical ako sa good na magawa ng Marxian tradition sa sociology kasi si Marx assumes lang na ang working class ay abused. Si Gramsci naman assumes na dominated yung working class ng hegemony. Hindi kasi natin dinideny ang possible yung oppression and exploitation. Pero to merely assume it in general without pointing kung saan yun specifically nangyari will not help us kasi hindi yun kumbaga hindi mako-correct yung evil sa social structure. So dahil dito masasabi natin na pseudoscience ang critical race theory and intersectionality. Next, critical race theory and intersectionality destroy itself. Dito naman ay where Pluckers and Lindsay talked about yung case system ng social justice. They explained na dahil sa internal complexity and single focus ng intersectionality sa oppression, ay riddled daw ito ng divisions and subcategories. This is where I would say na makita natin na the left is eating itself. Pluckers and Lindsay enumerated na people sa US ay nag-argue na ang gay white men at ang mga non-black na people of color ay need daw to recognize ang kanilang privilege and anti-blackness. Ang straight black men daw ay described as the white people of black people. May arguments din daw where trans people, such as trans men, ay kahit oppressed sila ay they need to recognize na nag-ascend na sila sa male privilege. Kailangan daw ma-amplify ang voices ng trans women dahil sila ay doubly oppressed kasi sila raw ay both trans at women. Ang gay men and lesbians daw ay pwede hindi ma-consider na oppressed dahil hindi sila na-attract sa trans men or trans women, which is considered as transphobia or misgendering. Ang Asians at Jews ay matanggalan ng marginalized na status dahil sa comparative na economic success sa demographics nila, which is deemed as participation daw yun sa whiteness. Ang queerness ay need din daw ma-decolonize. Kailangan raw questionin ang one of the main thinkers ng queer theory na si Judith Butler dahil isa raw siyang white na figure. Furthermore, aside from it leading to self-destruction and more conflict within their movement, we can see that it blurs also the lines ng morality, which makes it hard for people to make a stand against obvious evil. Ang example ni Pluckers and Lindsay ang human rights campaigner na si Peter Tatchell. He was accused kasi of racism dahil criticize niya ang black rap musicians na nagsing about murdering gay people. Another example ay yung confusion and conflict na dala raw ng case about ethnic minority beauticians na nag-misgender ng individual who claimed to be a trans woman. And dahil doon ay they declined to wax his testicles sa grounds ng kanilang religion and customs na nag-prohibit ng contact sa male na genitalia. Ang action kasi ng ethnic minority na beauticians ay taken to be transphobic. For this reason, it seems to me na nag-self-destruct ang worldview na ito. Next, critical race theory and intersectionality makes people less mentally and emotionally healthy. Sa dulo ng section na ito, Pluckers and Lindsay cited yung book na The Coddling of the American Mind. So si attorney Greg Lukianoff and yung social psychologist na si Jonathan Haidt ay nag-describe raw ng process na reverse cognitive behavioral therapy. Dito raw ang participants ay less mentally and emotionally healthy than before. Ang main purpose raw kasi ng cognitive behavioral therapy ay to train oneself na hindi i-interpret ang bawat situation in a negative light. At ang goal nito is to develop a more positive and resilient na attitudes about the world para we can engage with it as fully as possible. So yung ginagawa ng critical race theory and intersectionality, in contrast, ay we train people to read insult, hostility, at prejudice about interaction, which will make them see the world increasingly as hostile sa kanila, which will make them fail to thrive in it. Next, critical race theory and intersectionality are counterproductive against the fight against racism. So, sa section, makikita naman to sa section na noble ends, terrible means. And Pluckers and Lindsay argues ng central concern ng CRT and intersectionality is to end racism. And ang means nila is to make everyone more aware of race at all times and places. Ang assumption nila is that ang racism ay normal and permanent at ang problem particularly ay ang white people dahil they fail to see, acknowledge, and address it. Pluckers and Lindsay cites ang mga scholar activists na sila Heather Bruce, Robin DiAngelo, Gida Swani, at Amy Thurber na they argued sa National Race and Pedagogy Conference sa Puget Sound University noong 2015 na ang question daw is not, did racism take place? Kasi ito raw ay dapat assumed. Ang question daw ay rather, how did racism manifest in that situation? Dapat daw natin i-assume ang racism ay laging nag-take place at ang job daw natin is to examine ang situations for evidence of it. Ito ay nag-follow sa belief na lahat ng members ng society ay socialized na mag-participate sa system ng racism. That lahat ng white people ay nag-benefit from racism regardless ng kanilang intentions. Ang critical race view na ito ay nag-cause ng imperatives tulad ng racism ay dapat continually identified, analyzed at challenged. No one is ever done sa racism. At ang racial status quo ay comfortable for most whites. Dahil dito ay anything na nag-maintain ng white comfort ay suspect. Dahil dito ang predictable na reaction daw sa anti-racist na education nila ay resistance at ito raw ay dapat explicitly at strategically addressed. Ang may problem dito ay CRT brings back yung social significance sa racial categories at ito ay nag-inflame ng racism mismo. Black-Rose and Lindsay also mentions na if everything ay interpreted as racist, then hindi ito mag-produce ng desired results with white people. Ito ay mag-undermine raw ng activism kasi nag-create siya ng skepticism and indignation which produces reluctance to cooperate from white people. Black-Rose and Lindsay cited yung study ni David Rock and Heidi Grant entitled, "Is Your Company's Diversity Training Making You More Biased?" To show na sa diversity courses, if you say sa members ng dominant groups na racism is everywhere and that sila mismo ang nag-perpetuate nito, then ito ay nag-result to increased hostilities sa mga marginalized groups. They added to say na bad psychology to tell people na hindi naniniwala na racist sila, lalo na yung mga actively na nag-despise ng racism, na wala silang magagawa to stop themselves from being racists. Tapos you ask them to help you. Less helpful then if you tell them na ang good intentions nila ay proof ng kanilang latent na racism. Or if you set up traps sa kanila by telling them na if they notice race, then racist sila. And if they don't notice race, then ang privilege nila makes them have the luxury not to notice race, which is in itself a racist. Lastly, ang obsessive na focus nila sa race and ang naging feminist refusal nila sa color, and yung naging refusal nila sa color blindness actually makes people more racist. Ayun, so next, mag-proceed na tayo sa biblical critique. So now I was able to give yung 4 critiques. Mag-proceed na tayo to give biblical insights sa discussion on critical race theory. What we will say though in general ay hindi biblical at against sa gospel ni Jesus itong critical race theory and intersectionality. So first, against ang CRT sa biblical creation. Everything that God created kasi is good. This means na though corrupted ng sin ang creation dahil sa fall, dahil sa doctrine of creation ay we can say na ang whiteness ng skin ng isang tao ay hindi sinful in itself. Whatever ang color ng skin mo ay dapat mo i-accept dahil ito ay creation ni God which is good. Lahat tayo ay galing sa isang race, which is ang human race, that we are all in Adam. Second, though hindi sinful ang skin color in itself, ay we do not deny na nangyayari ang racism sa mundo. Ang sabi sa Romans 3:23, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Hindi lang sinasabi ng Bible na tayo ay lahat nag-sin, per by nature ay sinners tayo. Ang sabi sa Ephesians 2:1-3, "And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind." Third, ang main nakalaban natin ay hindi ang white people, but ang principalities and powers ng dark world. Ang sabi sa Ephesians 6:12, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." Ang context ng passage na ito ay about the whole armor of God. Ang verse mismo shows na sa paglist ng spiritual rulers, authorities, and cosmic powers, na pinapakita na may spiritual forces ng evil na nag-exercise ng power nila sa cosmic darkness na we experience. Though we must not worry dahil si God mismo ay stronger than all of them combined. Nevertheless, we need to stand firm and part ng strongholds na we need to destroy yung false worldviews like CRT. And so kailangan pa rin natin i-destroy yung mga ano na yun, na strongholds. Fourth, ang unity natin as Christians is in Christ. Ang sabi sa Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free. There is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Hindi ibig sabihin itong verse na ito ay tinanggal na ang distinctions like walang Jew nor Greek or walang male or female. Andun pa rin ang distinctions. Totoo naman kasi na may Jew nor Greek. At totoo biologically na may male at female. During their time, dahil may slavery pa and dahil doon ay may distinction then na makikita natin na may slave and free. And yung mga distinction dito, it produces sinful attitudes about superiority and inferiority. And despite this reality, we know na natanggal ang sinful na attitudes na ito dahil regardless ng socio-economic status nila, they are allowed to partake sa Lord's Supper. And ang mga people na considered as slaves ay pwede maging leaders sa church. Ang point natin dito ay lahat tayo ay united by virtue of our unity in Christ. So if Christian ka, ay part ka ng body of Christ. We're children of God regardless ng color ng skin natin, sex or socio-economic status. Fifth, we are against oppression and injustice, pero we need to do this based on evidence. Ang sabi sa Leviticus 19:15, you shall do no justice in court. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. But in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. This shows na di tayo biased for the poor or for the great people. Dapat impartial tayo. Against ang CRT, sa liberal notion of equality theory, legal reasoning, enlightenment rationalism, and sa neutral principles of constitutional law. Obvious ito sa paghil ng Black Lives Matter kay George Floyd. Though alam natin na may mali si Derek Chauvin, yung police na judge for murder and manslaughter kay Floyd, ang BLM and other people from the left hailed George Floyd as a saint who wanted to better his own life sa Minneapolis. Ang truth about him is that very far siya sa pagiging saint. He was arrested for delivering a controlled substance. He was also arrested for theft. He was also arrested for aggravated robbery, kung saan ang isang babae at isang toddler ay traumatized dahil sa ginawa niya. Ang death ni Floyd sparked riot sa US that even resulted sa murder ng some people and even destroyed businesses ng Black people who the BLM claims to help. Another example ay si Colin Kaepernick. Isa siyang San Francisco 49ers quarterback na nag-decide to kneel during the national anthem ng last preseason game ng kanilang team to protest laban sa violence na ginagawa ng mga police against Black people. Dahil dito ay lionize si Kaepernick bilang isang civil rights hero dahil sa pag-protest niya sa police killings ng unarmed na Black Americans. Don't get me wrong, we are also against unjust killings na done by the police sa mga helpless na civilians. Pero take note ang reason ni Kaepernick sa protest niya dahil daw ito sa deadly confrontation noong 2015 between the police and the 26-year-old naman na si Mari Woods. They saw na legitimate reason raw ang event na yun for protesting. Si Vody Bauckham ay nag-give ng 3 reasons kung bakit problematic ito. First, si Woods ay hindi innocent and hindi siya unarmed. In fact, when he was confronted ng police, ay nag-reach siya sa pocket niya ng knife na 8 inches long. Second, si Woods ay threat sa police at sa public. Ang police ay nag-respond dahil sa reported na stabbing and ang victim ay taken sa isang malapit na hospital. And ang victim ay nagbigay ng description ng tao na nag-harm sa kanya, which is ang person na found sa scene ng crime. Sa point na yon ay si Woods ay nag-draw ng knife niya and refused all 5 attempts ng officers to stop him from using the knife. Ayon daw sa report ay kasama rito ang verbal commands, ang OC spray or pepper spray, and ang less lethal options na beanbag rounds. Wala raw nag-achieve ng desired na effect. Hindi siya nag-obey ng commands kahit he was hit by rubber bullets. Nag-continue pa rin siya to threaten the police and ang civilians. And nung less than 10 feet away na siya, ay doon na nag-open fire ang police. Ang sabi ni Bauckham, and I agree, na tragic ang event, pero hindi siya pwede isite as an example ng police brutality na nag-warrant ng national protest. Ang fight natin against injustice ay dapat nag-rest sa foundation ng truth. So yes, we can fight injustice. And we can use different means to achieve this, such as protests, pag-file ng complaints, etc. Pero ito ay dapat based sa truth. Hindi dapat ito binibase to say na kalaban or kakampi yung isang tao by virtue of their skin color. Pero dapat based ito sa rule of law at ito ay dapat based sa evidence. So judge dapat ang tao, tulad ng sabi ni Martin Luther King, based sa content ng kanilang character and not by the color of their skin. 6. Ang primary na need ng tao ay ang gospel. Lahat tayo ay in Adam. In one sense, dahil considered si Adam and Eve as the first na human beings, ay human beings din tayo dahil galing tayo sa kanila. But more than that, dahil sila ay nag-sin against God, this changed their nature into a sinful nature. Dahil galing tayo sa kanila, ay we are born sinners. Ito ang reason bakit lahat tayo nag-sin, and kasama rito ang ginagawa natin na sinful prejudice, racism, and oppression against each other. And dahil dito, ay deserving tayo lahat ng punishment ni God. Pero hindi ito magbabago by merely changing the system. If ang hearts natin mismo ay hindi nabago, we are spiritually dead kasi. We can only become spiritually alive if God makes us alive. And God does this only to people na nag-trust sa person and work ni Jesus Christ. If they admit na they need a Savior and they trust with their life na si Jesus ay namatay sa cross to take their place, na imbes na silang maparusahan sa kanilang sins, ay si Christ ang tumanggap ng kasalanan and yung punishment na para sa kanila. If we trust sa work ni Christ, God will give us a new heart. We will become spiritually alive, and therefore we will no longer naturally act in a sinful way na nag-lead sa racism and oppression. All the more na we must preach the gospel to everyone. It doesn't matter kung ano ang color ng skin mo. If hindi ka in Christ, you will die a sinner and deserving of God's wrath. I believe na ang gospel mismo ang makakatulong sa atin to help na maging better place ang world dahil mas maging less racist siya. Ito ang primary na need nating lahat. So ngayon, I was able to give 6 na biblical insight in response sa CRT and intersectionality. So in summary, we talked about yung introduction ng CRT, yung spread ng CRT, and yung CRT bilang isang applied na postmodernist project. We also talked about yung intersectionality and intersectionality bilang applied postmodernism. And lastly, we talked about yung critique nila Pluckers and Lindsay against CRT and yung intersectionality then and yung biblical insights na we have in response. So ngayon, tapos na tayo and we can now proceed sa Q&A.